Hello, this is Pastor Laura Cavendish here at St. Paul Lutheran Church in Asheville, Ohio. We are ready to read part C of the third chapter in Making Sense of the Cross by David Lose. And that chapter, to recap, has been on ransom and victory. We have been talking about that theory as we left you. And now we are heading on to another section. And we had finished up talking about that it seems in this theory of ransom and victory that God has tricked the devil, and so God, you might say, beats the devil at his own game by tricking him into accepting Jesus as a ransom. So I think we'll continue from here.
You know, this all sounds weirdly familiar somehow, although it's hard to see why.
Did you ever read C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe?
Yeah, it was one of my favorites as a kid, though it's been a long time since I read it.
That story might be why this one seems familiar. This is the theory that Lewis more or less uses in his story. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Edmund, who's called a son of Adam, sides with the White Witch because she promises to make him a king.
I remember that. She's pretty scary, and I can see how she's sort of like the devil, tricking Adam and Eve, or in this case, a son of Adam, into sinning.
Right. And once Edmund goes over, she has a claim on him and is free to kill him. So the great lion Aslan,
who represents Jesus, right?
Right. Aslan offers to trade himself for Edmund.
As a ransom, I think I see.
As a ransom, yes. And the witch accepts, believing that once Aslan's out of the way, she can come back and kill Edmund and the rest anyway.
But Aslan doesn't stay dead, and so he foils all her plans.
Exactly.
Yeah, I can see how this is the theory that inspires Lewis.
Does it make a little more sense?
Yeah, I think so, with emphasis on little. But to be frank, I can't say I like this picture of God tricking the devil. I mean, it's one thing for the devil to go around tricking people. That's what we expect from the devil. But it's another for God to be doing it.
You're not alone in thinking that. In fact, that's where one of the other main variations comes into play.
I'm all ears.
In this case, the emphasis isn't so much on tricking the devil as it is on Jesus embracing the full human condition, including death, and winning a victory over it.
How does he do that?
In this version, the main enemy isn't just the devil, but death itself. And so Jesus enters into human life knowing full well that he will die. In fact, he knows that precisely because he is God in the flesh. Because he is God in the flesh. The devil, whose chief weapon is death, will come after him. And that's what happens. Jesus comes, and the devil, working through the people in power who are threatened by Jesus, puts him to death on the cross. It looks very much like the devil's won when Jesus dies, but in the end, Jesus is raised from death. And so death and the devil no longer have a claim on him.
I can see how that's great for Jesus, but how does it help us?
Because as the Apostle Paul says at one point, we are joined in baptism to Jesus, both his death and his resurrection. From Romans 6, 3 and 4. So because we're joined to Jesus through faith, just as he shared our death, we will eventually share his resurrection.
And he had to die for all that to happen?
Right. The only way he could defeat death was first to embrace it. There's just no way around the human condition. And death is perhaps the darkest element of that condition. But once he's died, that is, death has done its worst to him, and then he's raised. It's clear that he's stronger even than death. And so all those who are united to him through faith will also be raised from death.
This reminds me of another movie, actually.
Which one?
Star Wars, where Obi-Wan Kenobi meets Darth Vader, and they're dueling, and Vader's pretty sure he has the upper hand. And then Obi-Wan says, "You can't win, Darth. If you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine."
That's right. In this sense, the cross is like a mighty struggle between God in Jesus and death itself. And the only way to defeat death is to embrace it, to actually go through it and come out on the other side resurrected. So, like Obi-Wan, Jesus is struck down in order that he and all of us might become more powerful, that is, no longer subject to death and the devil.
Well, I think I like this version a little better. At least God's not a trickster, and I like the emphasis on the cross as a life-death struggle. That certainly rings true to Mark and Matthew's portraits of the very real pain and agony of the cross, and the idea that what looks like defeat, the cross, ends up being victory seems a whole lot like Mark's idea that God comes to us where we least expect God to be.
I think you're right.
You know what, though? I actually think it also matches up somewhat with John's version of the cross as well. This emphasis on victory reminds me of how in John, Jesus not only embraces death confidently, but in the end shouts out that his mission has been accomplished.
I think you're right. There are definitely tones of John's sense of victory, too. In fact, this version, in addition to being called the classic or ransom theory of atonement, has sometimes been called the Christus Victor, or the victorious Christ theory of atonement. It was developed in part by some other early Christians and then revived by a Swedish theologian named Gustav Ahlén in the middle of the 20th century.
Really? So it's not only the ancient Christians who believe this, but some people believe it today.
Ahlén argued that it was the theory that the 16th century reformers adopted, though others disagree. In all honesty, I say that over the last few centuries, it's been most influential in the Greek and Russian Orthodox churches, though they see it as more metaphorical than actual.
What do you mean?
They see the themes of ransom and victory as symbolizing how God entered into human life and freed us from death, sin, and the devil. They don't get too hung up on how it actually happened.
That's helpful to think of it symbolically, especially when I remember what you said about how some of the earliest Christians really struggled or were even persecuted for their faith.
And that's sometimes still true today.
What do you mean?
Just that other Christians, especially those living under oppression, have more recently recovered the symbolism of the classic theory of atonement as well. Sometimes it might be economic or political oppression, while at other times it might be because they are the minority religious group in their homeland, or it might be that they are struggling with addiction or trapped in an abusive relationship. Christians in any of these situations might see these forces of oppression and misery as linked to death and the devil, and they may feel very much that they are being held hostage by the forces of evil. So the imagery of Jesus taking on their situation, their death, and struggling to free them is pretty powerful.
Yeah, I can see that. And I can see how, to someone who feels trapped or held hostage, this would be a very important picture of what Jesus accomplishes through the cross. Even with that in mind, though, I still find it hard, to embrace it myself.
Why do you think that is?
I guess it's like you said up front. This is just a very different way of thinking about things, about life, about the world and God. It all seems pretty foreign to me, though. It's hard to describe it.
Maybe it will help us to go back to the 4 categories we talked about earlier.
I think that's a good idea. So we
Oh.
nailed down the problem earlier, the what needs to be fixed. It's the death and the devil that has a claim on us because of sin.
Right. And second question, how does God do that?
By coming in the person of Jesus to win us back, either by tricking the devil with a bait and switch Satan thinking he's getting God's favorite, but really getting God in human form, or by entering into the darkest and most difficult elements of human life and coming out on the other side victorious.
Very good. And the picture of God?
I guess the picture of God is one who wants to win us back. In fact, God wants us back so badly that God is willing to do just about anything, tricking the devil in one scenario and struggling to the death on the cross in the other.
What about our lives in this world? What does this theory of atonement say about how we should live our lives?
It doesn't seem to say a whole lot, actually. I mean, I can't see how this theory does a lot to help us think about what it means to be a Christian, except maybe to be grateful that I'm not the devil's hostage anymore.
I hear what you're saying, though I think the folks who live with this model would suggest it can influence our lives profoundly.
In what way?
Now that we are free from the clutches of the devil, we are also free. In fact, we need to stand against the forces of evil that once enslaved us. That is, now that we're back on God's team, we are called to resist oppression, addiction, tyranny, and all the rest wherever we see them.
Very interesting. And what actually reminds me, that actually reminds me of something else.
What's this?
Well, in talking about the Christian life, it reminded me of when you said that Jesus' life not only helps explain the cross, but the cross also helps us make sense of Jesus' life.
Yes.
It occurred to me that this theory doesn't seem to deal with Jesus' life much at all. I mean, do the things he said and did matter? Or do things only get interesting when we come to the cross?
That's a great question. Actually, Jesus' whole life on earth signals a lifelong struggle with the devil, a struggle that reaches its climax with the cross.
How so?
First, the fact that God would enter into human life is pretty incredible. The perfect joins the imperfect. The eternal takes on the finite. The incorruptible embraces the corrupted. God's taking our form in Christ is a huge event in and of itself. Second, each miracle of Jesus was a way of asserting that sin and death don't have the last word, that God's desire for creation is health, not sickness, abundance, not hunger, and so forth. Especially when Jesus heals people who are possessed, you can see him challenging the authority of the devil.
That's very interesting, and probably another reason this theory is comforting to people who are struggling, whether with oppression or illness or whatever. Life at times just plain feels like a struggle, and I can see how it would help to believe that our struggle isn't all there is, that somehow Jesus has entered into it and was victorious.
I think that's quite insightful.
Thanks.
Having said that, though, I think you're also right. This theory doesn't grow out of a close reading of the Gospels or deal a whole lot with the particulars of Jesus' life. It takes those elements as a starting point, but then it projects more particular concerns about life and death and the eternal struggle between good and evil onto those details.
You know, that helps me name a point I'm still stuck on.
What's that?
Just that in the end, it feels so, I don't know, mythological or maybe even theoretical. It's kind of a great story, pretty dramatic and all that, especially the version that emphasizes victory rather than just tricking the devil. But it doesn't really touch me.
Can you say a little more?
Sure. Maybe it's because I haven't suffered persecution the way the early Christians did. But I guess it just feels a little out there, not just in terms of being a bit far-fetched, for a modern person to understand, but more in terms of being a story about what God did that never really affects me, never makes a difference to me, never makes any kind of claim on me. I can listen to it and find it interesting and unbelievable or whatever, but it still seems like this huge story about the cosmic battle between good and evil that somehow never quite gets under my skin and does anything to me.
I think I see what you mean.
Remember when we said that part of the way we'll decide which of these different theories is right, or at least better, is how it makes us feel, how it explains things in a way that only makes sense, but also makes a difference to us? Well, I think that's what's lacking here. It kind of explains things, though in a way that's still hard to wrap my mind around, but it doesn't in the end make much difference in my everyday life, at least not most of the time.
That's a good caution to keep in mind. If we are facing extreme challenges and life seems to be conspiring against us, then this picture of God jumping into the fray and coming to our side to help us may be quite powerful. At the same time, it's so cosmic and mythic in scope that it runs the risk of being seen primarily as kind of a cool drama in the Star Wars way of things that rarely touches or shapes our everyday lives all that much.
Yeah, so while I really like the emphasis on the struggle and the victory, maybe it's time to move on to the next understanding of atonement.
Sounds like a good idea. I am really grateful to the readers that have been with me. We are at the end of chapter 3, and we will see you again. Remember, at the end of every series of readings, the following Wednesday has a Bible study that helps reflect on this series of readings. And if you're interested in having your own book or some way to have it on Kindle, remember you can email stpaulasheville@gmail.com and I'll help you get connected there. So thank you for joining us. And we'll see you the next time we head into a chapter, which will be this coming Thursday. So